We're super excited today to have Ann Cudd joining us from Boston University. Ann is the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Boston University. She's also professor of philosophy. Before that, she was at the University of Kansas, where I was, living behind me in the alley. She was not living in the alley. She was living across the alley in a lovely home. A lovely home. Yes, I've raised her since she was a whippersnapper. Yay, hi. No. Ann has done, Ann is a very interesting person for this lab because she has a undergraduate degree in mathematics. She's a philosopher. She wrote her dissertation on game theory. She studies feminism. She studies oppression, and she has a lot of overlaps with a lot of different interests that a lot of us have. So I thought it would be delightful to have her come by, and I will let you go ahead. She's
Great.
Tons of accomplishments, lots of books, lots of praise, all of that stuff. But I would rather hear what you have to say. So.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's such a privilege to get to come here and to speak with you. And thank you for allowing a philosopher to come in and talk about the metaphysics of the self. I don't think that's what Nancy had initially imagined that I would speak about, but I told her this is actually the most recent research paper that I've been working on. So she said, well, if you're passionate about it, then go for it. So, I am promising some implications of my work for something that I think maybe many of you are interested in. So basically, let me just get started. And let me provide some context of why I'm thinking about self-ownership and how this could play a role in the kinds of things that many of you think about. So if you think about it, there's a very basic moral or political question that moral and political philosophers should try to answer, and that is something like, what do persons have a right to do and to say? And what can society or other individuals force us to do on pain of some social sanction, whether that's, from just disapproval all the way to incarceration or worse. Okay? So any kind of social sanction. So what do we have the right to do, and what can society force us to do? And basically, philosophers' method, the typical philosopher's method, is to establish some basic concepts, some basic principles, go to sort of first principles, that can then ground a theory that can answer the questions. Okay, so our theory is usually built up with some kind of argument from example or analogy or counterexample, and really it's pretty basic. And so it's not usually empirical, although as we were talking about at lunch today, sometimes philosophers do a little bit of experimental work. But I'm afraid I'm not one of those philosophers. So it's basic argumentation. So that's the kind of methodology I'm going to use. So self-ownership is one of these basic concepts. In particular, it's a basic concept for libertarianism. So libertarianism, I'm going to be speaking of libertarianism, not very much, but a little bit today, as a political philosophy, and not necessarily in the sort of Rand Paul, contemporary political, empirically, practically political world. Okay, I'm going to be talking about, insofar as I do talk about libertarianism, I'm going to be talking about the basic political philosophy. So what libertarians do with self-ownership is they say that they posit this idea. They don't usually examine it very carefully, but they posit the idea that each of us owns ourselves. And they especially concentrate on this idea of ownership, and that brings a lot of moral, political weight with it. And it's because ownership rights are taken to be very stringent rights. They're rights to use or possess and exclude others from using, rights to dispose of or transfer some kind of a thing. So if I own my toothbrush, I can use it, I possess it, I can exclude you from using it, I hope. I can throw it away when I want to, and if I want to give it away, I can give it away. Okay, so there's something about, we think about ownership as having those kinds of claims. Now, of course, you can take those apart. You can make up different kinds of ownership rights legally. You can take all of those pieces apart. But basically, this is why libertarians are interested in this idea of self-ownership, is because it gives us a very solid, significant, stringent claim over our own bodies, and then by extension over the things that our bodies do, and in particular the ways that we gain the right to property. So libertarians, if you think about even old liberals, classical liberals like John Locke, who argued that from the ownership of ourselves, when we work on some unowned nature, maybe we pluck an apple from an apple tree that nobody owns, we come to own that through our labor. We come to own the apple that we have now labored on by an extension of our own bodies. Anyway, I'm not really going to talk much about that. I'm just trying to motivate the idea that self-ownership provides, especially for the libertarian, this important, stringent right over our bodies and then over our things. And libertarians appeal to this idea to say, first of all, that for each of us, our bodies or ourselves, whatever a self is in addition to a body, but over our bodies, we cannot be used or possessed without our consent. And, that's a pretty important right? That's one thing. And another is that our duties to help others or to do things for others can only arise from our voluntary consent. So libertarians are very keen to say that you cannot force me to help you unless I consent to some kind of contractual arrangement with you. Okay, so that's how you get this sort of idea of libertarianism that's, against taxation, that's for very stringent property rights, and builds this kind of cocoon, if you will, around the individual. Okay, and I'm caricaturizing a little bit, so if you're a libertarian, please feel free to attack that caricature, but I'm trying to do it for the sake of simplicity and clarity, and it's overly simplistic, perhaps. Okay, so that's the idea of self-ownership as the libertarian looks at it. And the ideal itself is, I think, has two very important characteristics. It's one, very individualistic. So the self is to be fully identified with the individual. On some theories, that's the individual body. And on other theories, you don't have to just identify the self with the body. It could be with the rational individual that's inside of me, or a rational individual. Okay, the thing that is the agent in game theory, or something like that, or in decision theory. And the other aspect of it is that it's an atomistic theory. So individuals are separable from the external world, at least in principle. Okay, so the people who populate a libertarian theory are these self-contained, self-sufficient rational individuals. Okay, so that might be familiar to some of you economists. And the theory, basically the theory of Homo economicus or something like that. It's not that different from that. So what I'm going to do in my argument today is I'm going to deny both of these aspects of self-ownership and argue that a self-owner, so an entity that can own itself, and that can be the foundation of a political or moral theory, is actually necessarily connected to other self-owners. So is not atomistic, but connected. Within a network of norms and social practices, and the social practices of guiding each other according to social norms. So that guidance and being guided by and guiding others according to norms, rules, practices, things that judgments of better and worse, that kind of thing, are really, really important to making us the kind of things we are, namely self-owners that can be the foundation of a moral and political philosophy. So are you with me? That's the basic context here that we're talking about. Okay, so I want to draw a sharp or a careful distinction between descriptive and normative individualism. So I take myself to be a kind of liberal in the large, broad sense of liberal, in the sense of what I would say is normative individualism. That is, I take the human self, whatever it is, to be of ultimate intrinsic moral value. Okay, so the whole point to me of doing political and moral philosophy is to, in some sense, give a theory that protects that individual moral self. We are of ultimate value. And descriptive individualism, by contrast, just claims that the human self can be described and explained by reference to forces and causes that act only on the individual, and not having to refer to any irreducibly social facts. So I think that descriptive individualism is false, but normative individualism is true. I think that the atomistic self-owner of libertarianism is a descriptive individualist theory. It's also normatively individualist, okay? But I deny the descriptive part. I don't deny the normative part. So, as I say, liberalism rests on normative individualism, but it need not embrace the descriptive one. And I think that libertarianism is a form of liberalism that embraces both descriptive and normative individualism. And just to give you a contrast, and I'm not going to be talking about this view at all, but communitarianism denies normative individualism as well as descriptive individualism. Okay? Yes?
Is that necessarily either or in the way you think about it? I mean, is it possible to both be a normative individualist and also a communitarianism that says each self is of ultimate intrinsic moral value, and so too is the community in which we all reside with one another?
I don't think that's impossible, and that's my view, but I think that's a kind of liberalism. But that's a really good question. Okay? So here's where I think the two might, I mean, I'd have to hear more about what you mean by communitarianism, but where they might split apart. Yeah, well, where they might split apart is, suppose you think that we should sacrifice individuals for the sake of preservation of some kind of community. So, for instance, not allow a right of exit from a community. There are communities that don't allow individuals to exit on without very, very significant costs that I would say is kind of a denial of right of exit. And to me, that's anti-liberal. Okay? But then you might say, well, okay, but then that's denying normative individualism. So I think you can't be a normative individualist and a communitarian. Okay, so here's the thesis that I'm going to defend. I'm going to argue that self-owners can't be the atomistic individuals portrayed by the concept of libertarian self-ownership. They're essentially constituted by their connections with other selves. So this word essentially is, obviously a pretty important word for a philosopher. It means I'm going to start talking metaphysics here, because it's got to be really, that's a strong claim, essential's really basic. So I'm giving a metaphysical argument because I think that's a more stringent argument than a merely causal one. So lots of libertarians will say to me, oh, of course we think that, infants have to be cared for by their parents and people need all kinds of care, and so causally, yes, we're all dependent on each other, sure, but essentially we are separable individuals. And so that's why I think I have to go to this metaphysical claim, or metaphysical plane, if you will. So join me in this quest on this metaphysical plane to really make the argument, right? In the end, if you all want to say, or some of you want to say, well, really, why do we care about the metaphysics? In some sense, I'll say, yeah, I understand where you're coming from, because what's really important ultimately is the politics, right? And what we actually hold each other accountable for. But my view is that if you want to defeat the argument, the best rational argument of the libertarian, you have to go to this metaphysical plane. Yes?
Is your argument predicated on the idea of there being a singular self, like a fixed singular self, as opposed to like a dynamic or like multiplicity of selves in a person?
I don't think it is dependent on that. However, if there's not a connection among those selves, then it's hard to say what the right self would have if it changes over time. So I think there has to be some kind of continuity. So I would subscribe to a psychological continuity thesis about personal identity, if that's, that's basically the philosophical problem I think that you're referring to. But within that, of course, if you psychological continuity is consistent with a lot of change over time, right? Just as long as there's kind of a memory or a connection from one moment to the next. Okay. Okay. So here's just to say a little bit more about why this has got to be a metaphysical argument and not a causal one. Or to say a little bit more about what that means. So I think you can separate out what I would call the causal origins of any given self. So, I was born on a certain day to a certain pair of parents with a certain set of, genetic components, nurtured by, the food that they gave me, and then taught by the words that they spoke to me, the various stimulants that they presented to me, and then over time, as I became a child and started playing with peers and so forth, there were further causal interactions that have formed me up to the point where I am the person that I am. So those are all, I think, causal origins of this self, right? The metaphysical origins of a self, though, are something a little bit different, and that is, what are the necessary, this is the question, what are the necessary conditions for something to be a self that is a self-owner? Okay, so that's a very much more basic and conceptual question than the causal question of how did I get to be the self that I am today? Okay, or even the generic causal question of how do people generally grow up to be the adult human beings that they are? So you can ask that causal question in those two separate ways, a very particular way and a more generic way that has to do with sort of the causal laws, right? And by causal, I mean, not just physical, but also mental and social causes. So the things that I think right now, the self, having these thoughts about metaphysics and so forth right now as I speak, has social causes and mental causes. So I've had previous thoughts about philosophy, about whatever, all of those things that have made me think the things that I think right now. So I guess I'm deterministic, right? That's just to say the self is deterministic. And there are social causes. So there are all kinds of different sciences that would play a nice role in explaining how human beings come to be the things that they are today in this culture with these thoughts, with these tendencies. But metaphysical origins has to do with what is a self-owner? How does it come to be the thing that it is? So if you're thinking about moral and political philosophy, and what you want to do is have a theory that holds regardless of the particularities of how the being came into existence causally. Right? And philosophers tend to want to do that because we want to have a moral and political philosophy that would work for robots or for entities on a distant exoplanet. Right? Doesn't matter. Provided that they are the kinds of things that are self-owners, this moral and political theory should fit for them. Okay? Okay, so so the assumptions I'm making about what a self-owner is, or has to be in order to be the grounding for a social and political philosophy, or for a moral and political philosophy, is that those self-owners have to be intrinsically valuable. They have to be capable of making and respecting, that shouldn't be respecting ownership claims. So, in other words, what is it to be an owner? Well, it's to be able to make a claim on something. So that's a basic assumption. What is it to be, if we want normative individualism to hold? Well, it has to be intrinsically valuable and not valuable just because of the advantages it brings to something else, right? It has to be valuable in itself. And the part about respecting ownership claims, and there I think if it's going to be an entity that's a grounding for a moral and political philosophy, then it has to be capable of basically acting morally. So it has to be able to respect the claims of others. Just capable of that. Might turn out to be an immoral version of one of these beings, but at least it's capable of understanding and respecting those. So, as I say, though, the metaphysical question doesn't assume that self-owners are necessarily human or even biological or that they're embodied. And an analogy to this kind of metaphysical question I'm asking is, think about chess pieces and chess boards. You could have a set of chess pieces that are made out of ivory, and you could have a wooden board. Or you could have a digital representation of chess pieces and the rules of chess and chess boards, right? And both of them are equally chess pieces and chess boards. It doesn't matter. So what makes them that is the set of rules that you're applying to the movements of the chess pieces. Okay? So, yes?
Are there examples you can give that would satisfy the criteria that would not be human, biological, or embodied?
Well, not human. Might be some other social primates. That'd be easy. But I'm not sure of that, but because I'm not a biological anthropologist, but I bet, maybe baboons are like this. I don't know. They could respect. Biological, well, you could imagine virtual beings. In fact, that would count as not embodied too, right? Algorithms, there might be, HAL, right? It could be a self-owner. That would, I don't think that Hal could be a connected self-owner. Well, maybe Hal is connected to the people that he lived among. Dave, right. Right, maybe between them, yeah. But that's why I'm trying to leave open the possibility of a virtual being and the idea that there might be an artificial intelligence where you would say it would be immoral to unplug it or to kill it because it's intrinsically valuable. Why? Because it's capable of the same capabilities of self-ownership that we are. I don't think it exists yet, but in our dreams, right? Okay, good. So this is just a little, representation of these sort of hierarchies of, so we, they're actually existing self-owners are a subset of the possible, physically possible ones, but the metaphysically possible ones are even beyond a bigger set, right? So I think that's just basic. Okay, so here we go. Here's the argument. Okay, now I need my notes. Okay, so the first premise is just to say that if the self-owners are to be foundational for moral and political philosophy, then they're going to have intrinsic moral value, and they have to have the ability to participate in some community or polity. It's just from the meaning of moral theory or political philosophy, really. Okay? If they're not valuable, then they're not sort of the subject of a moral theory. Okay? If they're valuable, I should draw the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value. I'm assuming that. So something that's intrinsically valuable is valuable in and of itself, right, without considering anything else. Something that's merely instrumentally valuable is valuable because it's valuable to something that is intrinsically valuable, right? So the subjects of moral and political theory, I believe, have to be, I don't think this is controversial, have to be intrinsically valuable. And what is it to participate in a community or a polity? Well, minimally, I think, it means that you're able to reflect on norms, rules, or something more informal rules that are given to you externally and guide your actions according to them. So, for instance, to learn that it's bad or wrong to do X, and it's good or right to do Y, or just some basic rules and some basic normative claims. Something is apt, appropriate, good, right, preferable, any of those kind of judgments. Okay? And then even more fully than that, more fulsomely, is to be able to guide others' actions. So minimally, you have to be able to guide your own actions according to these rules. But even better, real participation in a polity or a community is that you are not just the subject, but you're the agent as well. Okay? And that means, I think, in order to be able to do that reflection on norms and guiding one's actions according to those norms, one has to have mental states and intentions, beliefs, desires. Okay, so one has to be able to see what the norm is, consider an action, and judge whether that action fits the norm or doesn't. And likewise, judge about others' actions. Do they fit according to the norm or not? Okay? And right now I'm using norm in a very descriptive way, in the sense that it might be a bad norm, right? But it's a norm agreed upon by some community, okay, some group.
Does it trouble your definition to think about actions that violate norms as participation? If I'm murdering cold blood, am I still participating in a community, or have I stopped participating in a community?
Right. I'm just trying to get, as long as you can see that you violated a norm, then you're participating in this very basic sense. Acknowledgement, yeah. At minimal. And I'm just trying to get the minimum qualifications for something to be a self-owner, again, because I'm trying to get this metaphysical, very broad view and include everything in that we possibly can. And the reason for that is because suppose I make a very broad, all of these things could be self-owners, but the one thing that can't are the atomistic individuals of libertarian theory, right? That's, kind of the structure of my argument. Okay, so have to have mental states, intentions, beliefs, desires, so that they can take in norms, reflect on norms or rules. And what is it to be an owner? So, well, minimally, again, that's to have a claim over a thing that is owned, and a claim against others over others exclusively claiming it. And an ability to make use of or possess it. Again, this is just from sort of the very definition of ownership, what it is to own something. Okay? So what I am saying, though, is that one has to be able to actively make a claim. And that, again, is bringing in intentions and beliefs and desires. Okay? So I'm concluding from those last two premises about ownership and participation that a self-owner must be a thing that intends and acts and that can take and respond to norms. And that's just what, in other words, is a moral person. So philosophers always talk about what is a person, and there's kind of a high bar for personhood. It's not just having the right number of chromosomes or roughly the right number of chromosomes. It's actually having this ability to intend and act and take and respond to norms. So a self-owner has to be a moral person. Well, now the sort of key premise is to say is 6, which is to say that what makes a self's existence as this moral person, as this thing that can think, intend, and act, is that it's embedded in a normative web of meaningfulness. So why is that? Well, if I'm going to have an intention, I intend to do X, or I intend some sort of meaningful thing, it has to have a meaning for me. But meaning then immediately, I think, brings in language. And language is essentially social. One individual, atomistic individual, cannot come up with a language. A language is essentially social. And so I believe that once we are starting to talk about things as having intentions, beliefs, and desires, we've already brought in the social, namely language. But there are lots of other norms that also make our world meaningful. So our judgments of better and worse, apt and inapt, good and bad, also color the whole world that we live in. So we never see anything as, green there, chair, right? We see it as, oh, it's a certain kind of green, it's a chair that you can sit in, but you wouldn't want to lie down in it. There are all these judgments that immediately come with our perception. We never perceive things purely as some kind of data, but always we perceive it as something. And that, I believe, brings in norms and language. And if that's the case, so that is the sort of crux of the argument for me, if that's the case, then we are essentially connected in this web of social norms. We're essentially socially connected. Do you want to ask a question?
I was just curious whether somebody who understands some of the norms but not all the norms, or respects some of the norms or all the norms, would be considered an immoral person because they don't respect some of the norms.
Yeah, I haven't even gotten to that point, but and I would say, jumping ahead a little bit, there are many norms in any given community that are bad norms and should be flouted. There are others that are optional, right? It's normative for women to paint their fingernails, but it's optional, right? So there are these things that maybe are general judgments of better and worse in a community that, you don't need to.
I've been thinking about your inability to recognize a norm.
Right. Right.
Maybe you recognize some, but you don't recognize others.
I think if you can recognize one, you count as one of these intrinsically valuable self-owners.
Even if you go against it.
Oh yeah, right. Even going against it, right?
If you don't even recognize it.
Right. Yeah. That's when, if you can't, there is probably no second person who would count as that. somebody who's become comatose and will never regain consciousness again will count as not a self-owner on this. Doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to anything that's not a self-owner. I'm not saying that therefore we can cut down all the trees in the world because they're not self-owners. I don't want to say that. But I'm simply trying to make this claim that anything that we're going to ground a moral or political philosophy on has to be something that can recognize and guide itself according to norms. Yeah.
I struggle a lot with philosophy and it confused the hell out of me. And I think this is an example of that kind of thing. It feels like the concept of the self-owner, you're saying that needs to be practical for moral and philosophy, and therefore it has to be grounded in a notion of participation. And then participation has norms, and norms create
Right.
connection, meaningfulness, etc. So should I take away that this is not a useful concept without a community? Is that roughly what I should think of it? It's not even a well-defined concept. Is that the conclusion?
Right.
I reach?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the idea that a self-owner could be separable from all other possible self-owners, like there could be one in the history of, the Big Bang happens, then there's one self-owner, Robinson Crusoe, let's call him. He's out there, and that's impossible. So that's an impossible, metaphysically impossible, because he could never have a language, he could never have norms to guide himself according to. There's also the fact that, well, who's he going to make claims against? But that's not the point that I'm making,
Okay.
right? I mean, he might make claims against this flying asteroid that's going by or something. Yes.
So, like in a thought experiment, suppose that, like you take a human being and now you take him to another planet alone, and he stays there. Shouldn't he himself think of himself as a self-owner?
Good. Yeah. Yes. So. I think that once you've acquired norms and you remember them and you think, crap, I miss my family, but they would have wanted me to go on. Or, that's already a normative way of guiding your actions. So you've internalized these norms. I think we can internalize them and then, be all alone in the world. Now, if you then get hit by the asteroid and you have amnesia and you remember no norms and no language, you're no longer a self-owner. But yeah, so the Robinson Crusoe story, which is often brought up by libertarians as an example of the ideal man, right, is to me it's loaded already with all of the norms that he was, so didn't he keep a diary and stuff? I mean, he was very much trying to live like a proper Englishman. That's a very normative framework to be living within. Okay, so this normative web, I think, is constitutive of, philosophers love to use that term, constitutive of selfhood. And this is just to reiterate the main points of my central argument, and that is to be a person is to be enmeshed in a web of social relations. The normative web that we are enmeshed in is this emergent normative framework that we collectively create through our individual behavior in social interactions, right? So, but our individual behavior then creates norms. Nobody set out to probably to, create some silly norm that there exists today in fashion or something, but somebody, tried something out, and all of a sudden other people started copying, and pretty soon it became a normative way of dressing or acting or something like that. To use a Heideggerian phrase, which I rarely will do, but this is my favorite one, social institutions are always already there. Okay, so we're dropped into, as individuals, in fact, we're sort of dropped into this normative world that we find, and that shapes us inevitably.
Spider webs, as opposed to some other kind of structure?
There's a kind of an allusion to something that Willard Van Orman Quine wrote, but I don't know, maybe that's it. The web of relations, I'm not sure how much I've loaded into that, except that I think that you have to think of physical individuals as nodes in a network or a web, and that's a significant. So both the connections and the nodes are important. So I don't know. That's probably not a very good answer to why. I thought it was cool. The picture was cool.
Some other kind of connective.
Yeah, anything that would be connective tissue. A network is the other metaphor. So my conclusion: the normative web, including linguistic norms that connect individuals who are capable of moral personhood, and without which there could be no moral persons, it has to be itself intrinsically valuable. So it's not just the individuals, but all of our connectedness. So this is a relational account. So our relations with each other are also intrinsically valuable, not just the individual node. Yes?
I don't know if somebody already asked something like that. Does it count if you have a relationship with, let's say, with the environment, with nature? I'm thinking about indigenous community and their sense of society.
Yeah.
And so I am a kind of self-person if I relate with a tree. And for me, a tree is a living being that determines my norms because it's influencing my behavior. So that the individual can be something not human. You know what I mean?
So the thing is, a tree can't be a self-owner on my view. Okay, doesn't mean that the tree isn't valuable, but on my view, it would have to be instrumentally valuable. And so I would have to have a long conversation to figure out a way in which I would be able to see the tree as intrinsically valuable in the way that self-owners are.
And the man, let's say, or the woman that interacts just with the tree, let's say, if other people don't exist, is intrinsically valuable or not?
No, because it can't be a self-owner.
Yeah, okay,
Right.
I understand.
Now, I could imagine that, suppose there's one human being ever, and there's also one, other sentient being that can also form intentions, and where they could interact in some way. I could imagine that they could develop a kind of language between them, and eventually both become self-owners. That seems imaginable to me, like higher order primates or whales or dolphins, or So I think there are probably, I'm not enough of a biologist to know which things are, but I'm pretty sure trees can't be because they can't form intentions or beliefs or desires. Yeah.
I'm really curious because I feel like in my questions I'm hearing and in some of the other ones, I'm hearing an exercise where we're all looking to try to challenge your presumption, but in fact I think most people in this room have a kind of connected theory of humanness, whether it's the kind of social constructionists on the sociological side, the people who are studying webs of people and recognize the influence and they're building systems for it. So I'm trying to decide if you're arguing against someone who is no, they're atomistic individuals, people are billiard balls, they bump into each other, and they are otherwise alone, and it's those people you're challenging. Or are you saying, despite the fact that we're actually all connected, and we all know that, there's a convenient fiction that's sitting there that we kind of lean on.
Right.
And so you're trying to take apart the fiction.
Right. Yeah.
Which then, okay, so that's great. So then one question is maybe it's a fiction and it's a convenient fiction and it helps us organize things. And we could say it's a problematic fiction, and we could say maybe there'd be a better fiction that would better understand this. But if it makes sense to me that there's a world where I both recognize that I am deeply tethered to people through social relations and language, but I still have to have a way to have a contract, and that contract relies on I'm me, you're you, I have stuff, I can give you stuff, and it's your stuff.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So I think that's
we don't have to be no, I believe in atomistic individuals.
Yeah.
We should actually get to is this a foolish fiction for us to keep
exactly.
sticking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That's exactly the point that that I want to get to. So the response is often that, well, this is just an idealization, this atomistic individual, just like, idealizations in physics or in economics or whatever, right? And my response to that is to say the value of an ideal, in that sense, depends on its use, right? what does the theory give you that that you get out of making that idealization? Well, in political philosophy, it gives you libertarianism. So it gives you a theory that says you have no necessary obligations to others that you don't voluntarily contract for. Okay? I think that's a real problem. I think that's a problem for the world. I think that we actually owe each other some things by virtue of what we are given without ever asking or accepting voluntarily those things. That we inevitably have so much, that we owe it to the, pay it forward or pay it back, one or the other. We have an obligation to do that. And so the libertarian ideal that you actually should have a taxless state, except for defense or something like that, is a mistake, and it comes about as a result of this idealization. So I judge the value of an ideal based on what you get out of it, and I think you get something not so good out of it. So it's question begging to say, but it's just an ideal. Well, but it gives me this bad outcome. So let's examine the ideal. The ideal's a fiction. Here's the way in which it's a fiction. What would this give us? All right? So, I'm going to pass on by this because that was just to say there are lots of different causal origins of different. But let's move on to autonomy as an ideal. So, if we are these self-owners, what is an ideal way to be a self-owner? Well, traditionally, autonomy has been a value in moral and political philosophy for lots of reasons I could talk about later, but it's the basic idea of people as self-governors. So it's an ideal of freedom, right? I get to set my own, I get to set my own beliefs and desires and so forth, and nobody forces them upon me. Autonomy has long been thought of as a kind of individualistic notion, but more recently, and I'm talking about 20 years now or something of political and moral philosophy, a notion of relational autonomy has been developed, and particularly by feminists. And so that's the ideal of autonomy that would go together with this connected self ideal. All right? So what is one of these that's particularly appealing to me is the idea that an autonomous person is one who has the ability to participate in collective self-governments. So is not only a taker of norms, but also a giver. So can give and take, argue about, debate, disagree, agree, whatever about the norms. So on my view, the connected self could not be a lone originator of norms. Right? It's got to be others. But autonomous connected selves are both contributors to and participants in the making and giving of normative guidance. And so now we get a little bit of payoff. There's not very much because I don't have a lot of time. But a little bit of payoff is, well, the web of connection, society, community, networks, ought to allow each node within to become such a reciprocal participant, giver and taker of norms in order to promote this kind of relational autonomy. So we could now judge communities as oppressive or as autonomy enhancing. So those would be two opposites, depending on whether they enhance people's ability to be full participants in this norm creation or whether they force some people to merely be takers and the others get to be both givers and takers. Okay? So, so this is just the basic difference between the atomistic self-owner and the connected. I'm going to pass that one by too, because that's basically what I've said. So what are these autonomy-enhancing communities or networks? Well, they're the ones that encourage reciprocity, and one way of doing that is by encouraging or having norms of dignity and equality. Because if everybody has dignity and equality, they're authorized by the normative framework itself to be givers as well as takers of norms. So now I'm getting a little bit of political payoff here to this. And, you know, morally speaking, connected selves, good connected selves, moral ones, nourish autonomy in each other by teaching and encouraging autonomous capacities, that is, capacities to debate civilly or you know, without violence, and to talk about norms with each other, which of course we do all the time, right? This is what much of our conversation is about. It's about normative facts. And by discouraging violence and other emotionally or socially or psychologically damaging practices, which disable us from being these full participants in the reciprocity of norm giving and taking. And so basically, this is a basic principle, I think, and that is networks or communities that are not autonomy enhancing have no right to exist as such, and persons have moral obligations to reform those or to help those who are oppressed by them to find autonomy enhancing networks in which to exist. So, you know, now we can talk a little bit about online communities, and the sort of reciprocity that should be enabled by them. So just like communities in the material world, online communities can be either oppressive or autonomy enhancing, right? So if there are norms of bullying and shutting people down and so forth, those are obviously not autonomy enhancing. You know, there are some networks, some online sharing spaces that provide the ability to have full conversations without flaming and that sort of thing, but allow for continuing threaded discussions in ways that are more productive, let's say. And obviously, spreading false news is one way of psychologically damaging people. So, and then just for privacy rights, so I think we have a duty not to harm others. That's not autonomy enhancing, after all. And norms of trolling behavior or creating false news that gaslights persons or making defamatory false claims about people, and those kinds of things. Those are kinds of privacy violations, and some of them, they cause harm. And we have a duty, I think, to avoid doing things like harvesting personal data without permission or passing on data that's been legitimately collected in one way, but using it ways that then lead to these kinds of harms, or that that can lead to non-autonomy enhancing networks, right? And so I would say we can derive the idea that software developers have a duty to avoid having their products be used in such a way that they harvest personal data without permission or pass on data that's been legitimately collected in various ways. So, yes?
How do you think about different cultures having different normative webs? For example, the United States and the European Union having different ideals about self-control and autonomy,
Right.
and that we're seeing in exactly this issue.
Right.
Now Facebook is just like, well, we're not quite going to give North Americans the same kind of privacy protection as we give Europeans.
Yeah, that's just because they want to, abide by the minimal laws,
Right.
rather than.
Abide by the minimal laws. So is that a case where, from your perspective, you would say, well, Facebook is infringing on the autonomy of Americans
Yes.
and Canadians, they're wrong, or that's not the more moral way to behave, or is there an argument that could be legitimately made that said we're abiding by the norms of our community, which is the American community, and why should we be called to abide by the norms of another community?
Good. So what my theory allows us to do is to judge entire normative frameworks, right? So what we could say is that it turns out the North American normative framework, legal framework, is not the best normative framework. The EU has a better one, right? You could make it in terms of this autonomy enhancement and the likelihood of creating the false news and harvesting personal data. I didn't say much about why that's so bad, violations of privacy, but I could talk some more about that. But so this, I think, is a framework that gives us exactly the kind of ammunition we need to argue that the whole framework of the legal structure is inadequate at this point, right? Not that legal structures are the only ways of creating normative frameworks, but they're pretty important, and it seems like if we have these sharp disagreements, like Facebook on one side and, I don't know, others on the other, we're going to have to adjudicate that in a way probably that uses a certain amount of coercion and legal force is probably what's required. Yeah, Bill.
I have one question about connectedness. So I like the appeal to language as a basics for connectedness. I was curious about how that works with multiple languages, though. So, if I'm in a culture, I immigrated to a place where my government or my tax code doesn't speak my language. Am I still connected to them? Or if I'm in an indigenous community inside of a bigger country that doesn't recognize or connect my language, does that mean that I have any obligation to, participate or respect their norms? Or do you consider people to be connected if they speak different languages? Are they connected through?
Yeah, I think people will inevitably become connected when they meet each other. I mean, they're going to find ways of communicating, even if it's not through knowing exactly the language of each other. So I use the language maybe in a little bit of a minimal sense. But what I would say, in that a community that, say, takes in another community, a refugee community, say, of people who don't speak the same language and can't, is not going to be very autonomy enhancing if it doesn't help those individuals to communicate with the rest of the community. But I should also say that there are, I think, lots of autonomy enhancing normative frameworks. And so you could have two different communities that have very different norms, especially, aesthetic norms, etiquette norms, moral norms. Still, there could be some differences in moral norms, I think, that could both be autonomy enhancing and yet not exactly the same. Okay, so when they come into conflict, there's probably some respect norms that need to come into play in order to enhance the autonomy of both. But I do think that individuals need to have the right to abandon one set of norms and go to another community if their autonomy is not enhanced within a particular community. So once a self-owner, always a self-owner, sort of. So you don't have to speak the language that you're dropped into a new country and you don't speak their language. You're still a self-owner. But you're going to have to probably, to be an autonomous self-owner within this new community, you're going to have to learn some of their language in order to be able to participate. Yeah.
So continuing this questioning of normative frameworks, I'm struck by what seems like a use of, it seems like we're still trapped a little bit in this libertarian framework. There's an emphasis on privacy rights. And I think this pervades a lot of current policy discourse. If we just can protect our privacy, or if we're able to own our own data. So there's still this adoption of a kind of individualistic framework. And I'm just wondering if we can broaden the social imaginary and think about it in terms of not just individuals, but social rights, collective rights.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a vocabulary we can pull from?
Well, one thing is I think it's important, I don't know if this gets there, but it's really important to see why publicity is so important to us as well as privacy. So that's a value, because without publicity, our ability to make public to each other what we think and what we believe, we don't have a normative web, right? So publicity is very valuable, as is privacy, and I think privacy is valuable because, again, each of us is a node. Each of us does suffer an individual fate, if you will, and can be individually picked out for abuse or something like that. So what I think the connected self-ownership ideal helps us to see is how important it is to balance the needs of publicity and the needs of privacy. But maybe you're right. Maybe that still doesn't get beyond the individualism. And as I said, I am ultimately a liberal, just not a libertarian. And normative individualism is something I embrace. So maybe I can't get totally over to the communitarian side. So let's see. Somebody, yes.
So as much as I like this idea of this connected self-owner, I'm seeing several problems if you try to sort of put it out there as a strategy on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
So one is that a lot of these terms that you're using, which I love, like, normative, web and social relations and all this, a libertarian is just not even going to listen to any of those concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, one thing that we've learned about libertarians or similar behavior, especially in the last election cycle, from sociologists, is that their notion of group is very different from what, say, me as a sociologist would consider a group. So, like, Arlie Hochschild just had this book on, Tea Party movement, and the way that this group sort of thinks about who's their inner circle is very different. It's not everybody. It's not the entire web, and the various groups on the web. It's their immediate circle, and that's the care group that they would care about, harm for.
Right.
So how, again, how would you make them think about the web as the normative web as this larger community? And third, who's the subject that we're really talking about here? So we have all these individuals that are on the web, and many of them are thinking, I have libertarian rights. I can do what I want. I can commit hate speech. I can do, this is sort of my right. But it's not just individuals now. We know this is the difficult thing, is that the trolling and the false news is now being conducted by bots, right? Who we can't really talk to, and number two, by these Cambridge Analytica, like and Russian what do you call them, the trolling organizations and such. So it's these sort of illicit organizations, and it's these tech designers, and now it's like Zuckerberg, who is himself aligned with these groups who are doing these things. So this idea that there's a single sort of libertarian person that we have to convince,
right?
It's so difficult.
Yeah. So philosophy is pretty impotent. There's no doubt about it. That is, what I can say is, you libertarian, you have the wrong metaphysics of the self. Na. That's not very powerful in the world of coercive agents who are willing to use force to get what they want, right? I agree. But those who say, well, but I've got these rights, and that's actually no. If that is supposed to have some kind of moral grounding or some rational grounding, turns out you're wrong. But if you want to coerce me, well, I'm going to have to bring force against your force. That's true. So, philosophy is ultimately impotent against people who are willing to use force against others. As for the bots, though, they're created by actual human beings, and I'm saying, no, you have a duty not to create these things. Having a duty, that's, I am going to shun you if you don't stop creating those bots. I mean, that's not a very powerful position in the world of bad people. But in the world of those who are saying the right to, say, free speech regardless of the consequences for the community, well, no, actually, I'm going to argue that you don't have this kind of right that's completely unbounded. Yeah. So, yeah, it depends on the amount of force that your opponent's willing to apply. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the sort of the ownership concept at the foundation of it, and
yeah.
I can see why it's a very powerful anchor or grounding, but I also wonder if there are elements sort of implicit in the ownership concept, associations with possession, with control, with domination, that sort of pull against what you're trying to do on the connected side.
Yeah.
And if there were other groundings or metaphors that you would consider to do this foundational work.
Yeah. So maybe too much disclosure. I was assigned to do some kind of critique of libertarianism, and so I took up the self-ownership idea, and then I said, oh, there might be a different way of thinking about it, right? But then the question is, why preserve the idea of self-ownership? And I can think of 5 reasons, okay? So, I think it retains this idea of claim, so ownership brings with it claim. It preserves the idea that there is this node in the self that is of primary moral importance. The individualism, the normative individualism, I think, comes with it. But it also, because it's connected self-ownership, it suggests that the creation of selves is a collective endeavor. I think the ownership metaphor brings some good things, but I agree, there are some bad things too. But it suggests investment, and that we're sort of paying forward. That's what investment is. That we have an obligation to invest ourselves in the project of this norm creation in order to be really autonomous, fully fulfilled beings. And then finally, it's a traditional liberal way. So going back, really, you can trace it back to at least the 15th century, a traditional way of thinking about it. And also we have a compliment to somebody is to say, oh, you're very self-possessed, right? It's a kind of confidence and so forth that is supposedly admirable. So there are some good aspects to it, but I admit it might come with so much baggage that it's not a good idea. Yes?
I wondered if you played with the idea of agency. And just how I can see all the arguments there, and that makes sense, but within philosophy, is there room to make agency the shuttle that's connective and still allows for some sense of self-determination, but the self can be indefinite or open-ended in a more in an agency approach?
Yeah, I think absolutely. The idea of agency doesn't necessarily come with this idea of a claim, a self-possession claim, but certainly agency is always a very important concept for philosophers. So, yeah.
I think that
we're a little over, aren't we?
past time. I think, are there treats outside? There's supposed to be. Okay, there's supposed to be snacks out there. We can mingle and chat some more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.